Ready to go down the rabbit hole?
So today we're doing a deep dive into, well, one of the most mysterious and, let's be honest, confusing passages in the Old Testament. We're talking about Genesis chapter 6. We're going to be tackling the Nephilim, the giants, and this strange corruption that led to God's judgment in the flood.
It's an area where, curiosity can really overshadow clarity. So our mission here is to get some solid footing on where these giants came from, both before and after the flood. But, and this is the important part, we ultimately have to look past the sort of sensational nature of it all. We have to get to the monumental importance of Genesis 6, verses 6 to 8.
Because that's what sets the stage for everything.
It sets the stage for God's character and the entire biblical story of redemption. It's huge.
If you miss that pivot, the flood just looks like this arbitrary act of destruction, not the necessary judgment it really was. So let's start at the beginning. Genesis 6, verse 1.
Yeah, where the scene is set.
It says, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them." It's just confirming the creation mandate from Genesis 1, verse 28. Be fruitful and multiply.
Exactly. And that right there, that answers the first question people always ask. How did humanity multiply so fast? People think it was just Cain, Abel, and Seth.
But it wasn't.
No. Genesis 5, verse 4 explicitly says Adam had many sons and daughters.
So the names we get are just the anchors for the story, but the family was, it was expanding dramatically.
And you have to remember, the human genetic line was still pure. So marriage between siblings, it was necessary and it was permissible back then. The prohibitions we see later, like in Leviticus 18, they didn't exist yet.
Okay, that makes sense.
So by the time we get to Genesis 6, we're not talking about a small household. This is a developed civilization. Cain built a city. They had metallurgy, music. People were living for centuries. It's a vast, flourishing global population.
And that leads right into the Great Crisis. So let's unpack that, starting in Genesis 6, verse 2. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. This is it. This is the crux of the whole debate. Who are the sons of God?
The most natural reading, and I think the one that's the most textually consistent, is that Bene Elohim, that Hebrew phrase. It refers to angelic beings.
Specifically fallen angels.
Specifically fallen angels.
But why is that reading considered the strongest? You hear other interpretations, right? Human-based ones.
You do, but they run into problems with textual consistency. If you just follow the phrase Bene Elohim through the Old Testament, in places like Job 1, verse 6, Job 2, verse 1, even Job 38, verse 7.
It's always angels.
It's always angels. Supernatural beings presenting themselves before God. And then the New Testament comes along and basically confirms it.
Okay, how so?
Well, you have Jude verses 6 and 7. It explicitly links angels who left their first estate with sexual immorality, calling it going after strange flesh.
Strange flesh. That's a powerful phrase.
It is. And then 2 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5, links the sin of those specific angels directly to the days of Noah. The combined testimony, it just points squarely to a supernatural violation of the created order.
Which makes that other big interpretation, the sons of Seth marrying the daughters of Cain, it makes that really hard to maintain.
It pretty much collapses. First, nowhere in Scripture is Seth's line ever called the sons of God. But the biggest problem, the one you can't get around, is the offspring.
The Nephilim.
Right. Normal human marriage, even between godly and ungodly lines, it doesn't produce literal, physically enormous creatures. And that's what Genesis 6, verse 4 immediately introduces. The judgment of the flood makes sense for a shocking violation of creation, not just poor marriage choices.
Okay, so let's define these Nephilim. The Hebrew root is nephal, which means to fall. So fallen ones. But the Septuagint, the Greek translation, uses the word gigantes, giants.
And the two ideas lock together perfectly. They were the giant offspring that came from the fallen angelic beings. Their origin was fallen, and their physical form was gigantic. This isn't an allegory.
And we know it wasn't just an allegory because of the descriptions we get later. This is where it gets really interesting with actual historical touch points.
Yeah, think about the physicality implied here. When the spies go into Canaan, their report in Numbers 13, verse 33, says they saw the Nephilim and felt like grasshoppers.
Grasshoppers. That implies a truly shocking scale.
It does. And then you have the famous example of Og, the king of Bashan. His iron bed, which is mentioned in Deuteronomy 3, verse 11 as a real artifact, measured about 13.5 feet long.
13.5 feet.
These were literal, physically enormous people. And they're the same lineage linked to the mighty men which were of old, men of renown, back in Genesis 6, verse 4.
So, this sweeping corruption happened. Let's look at God's response in Genesis 6, verse 3. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years."
This is God's first verbal reaction. It shows his patience, but it's also a warning. His restraint is being withdrawn.
What does strive mean there?
The Hebrew word is din. It means to contend, or to judge, or to restrain. The Spirit had been holding back the tide of human evil, but the corruption, both moral and physical, became so total that God's restraint was going to end. Man had become wholly flesh.
Corruptible, earthly.
Completely, and wholly devoted to evil pursuits.
Okay, but the 120 years, that's a number everyone knows. People often say that's the limit on human life now. Is that what this verse means?
The biblical data itself really contradicts that. I mean, think about it. Noah, Shem, Abraham, Jacob.
They all lived far longer than 120.
So it's not a biological limit. No. In this context, it's a 120-year countdown to the flood. It's a period of divine patience, a final call for repentance. 1 Peter 3, verse 20 even confirms this later. God set a timeline for judgment, not a new lifespan.
Okay, now we get to the really challenging part, the post-flood mystery. Genesis 6, verse 4 says, "There were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that."
That little phrase, and also after that.
It's a crucial time marker. It confirms that the Nephilim existed both before and after the flood.
It's an undeniable fact of the text. And we have the evidence later on. Numbers 13, verse 33, the spies say the sons of Anak come of the Nephilim. The giants were definitely real post-flood.
But here's the paradox. If the angels created them before the flood, and those angels are now imprisoned, how did the giant lineage survive? Because we have to rule out a second angelic invasion, right?
We absolutely do. Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2, verse 4 are very clear. The offending angels are permanently imprisoned in everlasting chains. They can't repeat the act.
So, if the angels are locked up and only 8 people survived on the ark, how?
Well, the only biblically compatible mechanism left is that the corrupted lineage, the DNA, survived through one or more of the women on the ark.
And this whole theory really hinges on the very specific description of Noah in Genesis 6, verse 9.
Yes, it does.
It says he was a just man and perfect in his generations. And that word for perfect is tamim. What does that mean here? Why is it so important?
Tamim is a powerful word. It usually means complete or without blemish, like for a sacrificial animal. But here, given the context of all this physical and moral corruption we've been talking about, it almost has to carry a dual meaning.
Moral integrity.
And physical or genealogical purity. Noah was pure in his character, yes, but also his family line was preserved from that supernatural corruption.
But the text is so careful, it limits that description, that word tamim, to Noah alone. It says nothing about Noah's wife or his sons or their wives.
And that exclusivity is the key. That silence is screaming. If everyone on the ark had been genetically pure, Moses probably would have just said Noah and his family were perfect in their generations, but he doesn't. The text leaves the door wide open for that genetic corruption to have survived in one of the women who came aboard.
And that would provide a mechanism for post-flood giants that respects both biblical facts. 1, giants exist after the flood, and 2, the angels are imprisoned.
Exactly. And the theory gets even more circumstantial support when you look at where these giants pop up later.
The Canaanite lands.
Precisely. The Rephaim, the Anakim. They consistently appear in the Canaanite sphere, which is Hamite territory. This makes it plausible, not dogmatic, but plausible, that the corruption passed through Ham's wife. It might even shed some light on that unusual and very specific curse on Canaan in Genesis 9.
So what's fascinating to me is how quickly the writer of Genesis moves on from the giants. I mean, they're the hook. They're what grabs your attention, but they're not the central message.
Not at all. The theological heart of the chapter shifts dramatically in verse 5.
Right. It goes from the supernatural mystery to God's moral indictment, Genesis 6, verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually.
That's the ultimate takeaway. The flood wasn't just about the Nephilim. It judged a pervasive, total moral rebellion.
And the language is so absolute. The wickedness was great. Every inclination. The Hebrew is yetzer of man's heart was only evil continually. Kol hayom. All the day, there was no break from it.
No moral relief. And this leads to God's profound emotional response in verses 6 and 7. It says God repented that he had made man. The Hebrew is Nashem.
And that doesn't mean God made a mistake.
No, it doesn't mean he changed his eternal plan. It's an expression of profound grief, of deep sorrow over man's complete corruption. God's holiness was offended.
So the judgment was a righteous necessity, but one born out of grief. And the destruction that followed was total. Man, beast, creeping things, birds. It's like a judicial decreation of this corrupted world.
But then the entire narrative pivots on a single word in Genesis 6, verse 8. It's like a lighthouse in the middle of this dark storm.
But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord.
Grace. The Hebrew is tone. This is the very first time the word grace appears in the entire Bible. And it acts as this dramatic pivot from universal, total judgment to divine, specific election.
And it emphasizes the order of things. Grace comes first. Verse 8, Noah finds grace. Verse 9, Noah was righteous.
Exactly. He was righteous because he found grace. God preserved this righteous, unblemished line through an act of elective grace. That's how the promised seed from Genesis 3, verse 15 survives. The whole point of the passage isn't the giants, it's the character of God. His grief, his judgment, and ultimately, his electing grace.
So to summarize our deep dive then, we've established the angelic origin of the pre-flood giants. We confirm that post-flood giants are a biblical fact, and we've identified the only really plausible way for them to reappear through one of the women on the ark. But the real anchor, the reason the story is even here, is Genesis 6, verses 5 through 8.
The whole Nephilim narrative, for all its intrigue, it only takes up a few lines. The writer moves so quickly from these spectacular creatures to the condition of the human heart and to the character of God.
And that leaves a really provocative thought for you to consider. What does it tell you about the relative importance of historical curiosity versus theological truth? That the existence of supernatural giants is treated almost like a side note to the story of God's redemptive grace. Because that's the message that truly sets the stage for the rest of the Bible.